Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this episode in the Fearless Minds research series. Unequal Access, Global Issues with COVID-19 Vaccine and Treatment Distribution. I'm Terry Webb from Flinders University's Fearless Minds team, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this episode as we talk about the global inequities in access to COVID vaccines, treatments and tests, and the role of intellectual property waivers in this space. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge that we're hosting this discussion on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We also acknowledge and convey our deep appreciation to the elders of all the nations upon which Flinders operates. This event is delivered as part of our Fearless Minds series, which introduces you to some of our most engaging early to mid-career researchers and their latest research from a diverse range of fields. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr James Scheibner, a lecturer in law at Flinders University and a researcher into intellectual property and health law, as well as industrial property law and data protection law. James, thanks for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit more about your research interest in vaccine inequity and the impact of patents on the manufacturing and distribution of COVID vaccines?
Well, my interest in this topic first came out of my PhD topic. So in 2018, I completed a PhD on intellectual property law, looking at the relationship between open source licensing and open source bioinformatics development, and looking at the ways that formal intellectual property laws and informal norms have an impact on open source bioinformatics development. Now, that term open source is a very broad one, and it encompasses a whole range of different forms of development, ranging from open source software development, so thinking about things like Linux, for example, and different scientific research tools, to what we might describe as, for instance, let's say, equitable treatment programs or equitable development programs, which are largely publicly funded and are designed to benefit those who need it most. So, for example, primarily those in low and middle income countries when it comes to certain types of neglected diseases, as well as certain non-for-profit organisations and government organisations. So my research in this area builds off my PhD research, and in particular, the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown into sharp relief the ways that intellectual property rights can sometimes impact the equitable distribution of certain therapeutics and biologics around the world.
Can you give us a broad snapshot of the distribution of COVID vaccines around the world? I mean, it is very unequal, isn't it?
That's putting it mildly. So at the end of November, 69% of the world's population will be vaccinated. However, if we drill down into those figures a little bit further, that rate rises to 80% for high-income countries, but it falls to just under 25% for low-income countries. So there really is very unequal distribution, even today, in the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines.
What about COVID treatments and tests? To what extent are there inequities in those?
Well, we've already seen some of the inequities in access in Australia. At the start of this year, you might recall the mad rush for rapid antigen tests as a mechanism for testing individuals. And I believe a professor of health economics at Flinders University, John Carnan, has already published a number of articles demonstrating that it would actually be very beneficial from a public health perspective to make rat tests publicly available. But even if, as we step outside Australia, those inequities become even broader. Only 0.4% of the COVID-19 tests, which were conducted for 2022 so far, have been conducted in low-income countries. And so far, we've also seen that some of the more virulent strains of COVID-19, so for example, the Omicron variant and the Delta variant, have come out of South Africa and India, which coincidentally are countries which have at least in the case of South Africa, countries which have very low vaccination rates. So this is quite problematic, not only from a public health perspective, but also from a public health surveillance perspective. We would like to make sure that testing is high as possible to ensure that we see new variants coming and we plan for those accordingly. Now, with respect to treatments, there are currently two very promising treatments. So the first of these is Paxlovid, which is produced by Pfizer. The second of these is Lagavrio, which is currently produced by Merck, Sharp and Dohme. Now, a course of treatment for Paxlovid currently retails for about $500 in the United States and about $700 for Lagavrio, respectively. So that comes to about $800 Australian dollars and about $1,000 Australian dollars, respectively. However, these drugs currently, the supply is restricted, so there are limited quantities of each of these drugs, and in particular, we see that the distribution of these drugs is largely concentrated, once again, in high-income countries as opposed to low-income countries. And this is particularly problematic as these drugs are targeted at immune-compromised individuals, they're targeted at the elderly, and therefore, if we want to reduce the disease burden of COVID-19 and reduce the number of deaths, we would like to make sure that these drugs are made available to individuals who might be at risk of complications from COVID-19 as widely as possible across the world.
So what are we doing to help poorer countries? What sort of solutions are we putting in place to help them recover from the pandemic?
Well, one of the solutions that was proposed at the end of 2020 was the so-called TRIPS waiver. And this was a broad proposal which was sponsored by India and South Africa and presented to the World Trade Organization. And this proposal suggested that WTO members should suspend intellectual property rights, and specifically what we call the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights provisions which apply to COVID-19 related products. And that not only includes vaccines, but things such as personal protective equipment, such as masks, such as treatments and tests. However, by the time that that agreement was negotiated and the agreement that Australia supported at this time was narrowed down to a very narrow waiver, which essentially applied to vaccines only and only created an additional removed an additional export restriction on the transfer of vaccines from high to low income nations. So it really made a very minimal difference in terms of actually reducing or increasing the availability of vaccines. And furthermore, it doesn't apply to treatments and tests. So this is a glaring weakness with the TRIPS waiver that was currently supported. Currently, there is a deadline of 6 months, which expires on the 17th of December for WTO member states to renegotiate this current waiver, limited as it is, and determine whether it should also apply to treatments and tests. And even though there is still significant support amongst low-income countries, India and South Africa, most notable of these, a number of countries, including the United Kingdom, Canada and Switzerland, are currently opposing attempts to extend this waiver more broadly. And Australia really, although Australia is currently working hard in order to try and offer foreign aid and support to our immediate nation and immediate neighbours in terms of COVID-19 support, there's really more that we could do in order to push this waiver forwards.
Now, there are licensing agreements allowing generic manufacturers to make their antiviral treatments for poorer countries. But this means that upper middle countries such as Thailand, China and Mexico miss out. So what needs to be done to ensure that all countries get better access?
So this is a really interesting question, and it's one of the issues that emerged in relation to the original waiver as it applied to COVID-19 vaccines, but it's also relevant to the therapeutics. Now, at the time that the COVID-19 pandemic first emerged, the World Health Organization took steps in order to establish an initiative known as COVAX. And the purpose of COVAX was not only to act as a technology transfer pool to encourage the various pharmaceutical companies manufacturing COVID-19 vaccines to distribute or license their intellectual property rights on a gratis basis, but also for countries to make vaccines available via donations. Now, unfortunately, COVAX has somewhat failed in its initial mission, which was to try and make sure that an equal proportion of each country was vaccinated before other high-income nations could proceed with vaccinating their populations. The threshold was set that should be 20%. So all nations should at least have 20% of their population, mainly those in frontline support roles, so healthcare workers and so forth, should be vaccinated before any country proceeds with vaccinating the rest of its population. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that a number of high-income countries have bilateral agreements with pharmaceutical manufacturers, which meant that they had priority access to certain vaccines. Another issue here is that, and my research has shown this, that some of the most important intellectual property rights over COVID-19 vaccines not only relate to the patents which have been sought for those vaccines, but also the trade secrets. And there's a certain amount of know-how which is associated with the production of each of these vaccines. Now, as it stands, there are no mechanisms to compulsorily acquire know-how as there are for licensing agreements for other forms of pharmaceutical products such as therapeutics and biologics. So it can be very difficult to go to a Pfizer or go to a Moderna-style company and say, please hand over your trade secrets.
So how do we help? How does the Australian government, help to reduce the burden on these poorer countries?
So there are a number of steps that we can take. The first step that I would say is that we need to support the proposal to extend the original TRIPS waiver, limited as it is, to include therapeutics, and that should be done by the 17th of December deadline. In the alternative, we should look at other mechanisms to keep on extending this waiver and look for other diplomatic strategies in order to try and break the deadlock. It's important to note as well that keeping up this pressure not only has an impact on other countries, but it also has an impact on pharmaceutical companies. So that will create public pressure for them to take steps in order to make vaccines and treatments more widely available. And this was exactly what we saw with the AIDS crisis at the turn of the millennium. A lot of pressure from civil society organisations was what really broke the deadlock and encouraged big pharmaceutical manufacturers to make AIDS retrovirals much more widely available in low-income countries such as South Africa. The second step that we can take is direct and indirect donations. So we can direct financial resources to our neighbours as well as lowest income countries, but we can also take a step in increasing our rates of domestic manufacturing of therapeutics and making those domestically manufactured therapeutics more widely available to our neighbours as well as those countries in that low income band.
And a lot of work to do.
Indeed.
And now you completed your PhD in 2018, I believe. What advice would you give to someone thinking of pursuing a career in research or undertaking their PhD?
So there's a number of things that I would say. So the first is that I had a relatively conventional pathway to completing my PhD. I started my PhD a year after I graduated from law school, or 2 years after I graduated from law school. I dipped my toes in private practice and decided it wasn't for me, so I came back to do my PhD. So I think the first thing I would say is always think about the reasons why you are completing a PhD. What goal do you seek to achieve? For me, it was that I enjoyed working in academia and I enjoyed doing research. So make sure that you have that goal very firmly in your mind before you start. Don't do it because there are no other alternatives. Think about that very carefully, because a PhD does take a long time to complete and it is a significant investment. So, always think that through. The second thing is always choose your topic and your supervisors very carefully. In particular, I had two excellent supervisors, Emeritus Professor Diane Nicol and Associate Professor Jane Nielsen, both at the University of Tasmania, and they were fantastic career mentors for me. They really took steps to give me advice on how I should complete my PhD, on publication strategies, on approaching conferences, on methodology, and so forth. The third thing that I would say is, and this is some advice that I received from my mother, who also has a PhD, is that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. There are going to be some days where it feels very overwhelming and it feels very difficult, and you're not going to want to do that anymore. But it's important that you stick at it and you pace yourself and you don't let it overwhelm you. And remember to be kind to yourself, that not all the days that you're going to be working on your PhD are going to be those groundbreaking Nobel Prize winning days or even the A-star publication days. A lot of them are going to feel a bit like Sisyphus rolling a boulder up the hill. Yeah. So just stick at it and don't let it overwhelm you. Those will be my 3 pieces of advice.
Oh, that's great advice. And this has been a wonderful discussion we've had today. Look, thank you, James, for sharing your time and knowledge with us. And remember, you can watch any of our past Fearless Minds episodes on the Flinders YouTube channel. Thank you once again, and bye for now.